I'm talking to you today about fair housing. So a little bit of context. In the mid 60s, the president was Lyndon Johnson, and he is arguably the greatest civil rights president, is certainly of that era at least. Of course, we can't forget that the pressure that was being put on him by the activists, but there was the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which he signed into law. The Congress always, of course, passes laws, but he signed into law. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, but there was also the 1968 Civil Rights Act, which is often just called the Fair Housing. The fair housing aspect of it is really emphasized. Johnson had done quite a bit for the economic conditions for African Americans. He had this program called the Great Society, and part of this was a war on poverty. So he created things like the Job Corps and Upward Bound, and I have kind of a connection to those because I had at one point sort of worked for both of them. I did way back. I did my student teaching. Did some work with the Job Corps, which is sort of a training school. And for instance, students that maybe had dropped out of high school, it's kind of a second chance for them to learn skills. Also, the Head Start program, Medicare, Medicaid, these were all parts of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. And in some ways they were effective that economically, in 1960, over half of blacks were living under the poverty line. And by 1968, it was more roughly about a quarter of African Americans that were living under the poverty line. So there had been some economic changes in the 60s in the favor of African Americans, and conditions were improving. But one of the main things that was kind of left unresolved was housing discrimination. So there were several different ways that discrimination was sort of put into practice. One would be called redlining. And that was essentially when banks would not give loans to African Americans. They sort of characterized them as high risk for loans. So it made it tougher for African Americans to get loans for houses. Another way was steering. And that means basically when real estate agents would steer people away from certain neighborhoods and to try to maintain segregated neighborhoods. A third way, a very blatant way, was restrictive covenants. You hear of these in communities today. It might be that you can only paint your fence white or a certain color. You can't paint it orange, for instance. But some of the restrictive covenants blatantly said no African Americans, or even to have them over to your house was sort of part of a restrictive covenant. So these things, of course, are things of the past for the most part. But also the realtor associations. So I used to be a real estate agent, so I know a little bit about this. But today, it's part of the code of ethics that you're not going to, say you're not going to show African Americans a certain place or something. But previously, prior to the 60s, in a lot of the realtor associations, you had a duty to your client to try to get them the best value for their home. And so many of them regarded it as their duty to not show African Americans in a certain community because it was this concept that it would lower the value of the homes there. So this was actually written into a lot of the Realtors Association's code of ethics. So it was not just sort of an individual, racist agent or something. It was actually kind of part of the systemic problem. And so these are some of the things that the Fair Housing Act of 1968, part of the broader Civil Rights Act of 1968, addressed. And so today, if for instance, if you're looking for a home or if you're even looking for an apartment, that they can't discriminate. A regular apartment complex, for instance, cannot discriminate based on this sort of acronym called fresh corn. So take the vowels out, just go with the consonants. So it's FRSHCRN. So I'll give you a second, maybe pause the video to try to guess what those would be. The FRSHCRN. And they cannot discriminate. The F is familial status. The R, of course, is race. S is sex. H is handicap status. Let's see, C is color. R is religion, and N is national origin. So these things have been placed into law. And, so for instance, if you're a real estate agent and you say to someone, well, you don't want to live in that neighborhood because it's, there's minorities or something, not only is this against the code of ethics in the realtor associations now, it's also a federal offense. So these things have change some of the ways that the discrimination is within law and within these realtor associations. Clearly, there's still segregation problems, and there are still people that maybe don't follow those. But in terms of the law and in terms within these associations, things certainly have improved, largely as a result of these laws in the 1960s. Thank you.